Seven, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast. Hello and welcome to the History with Jackson podcast, the podcast where we bring up-to-date historical research to you in an accessible and digestible way. Okay, so hello and welcome back to the History of Jackson podcast. Today we are joined by author and historian Louis Ferrante to discuss his brand new book and book series, Borgata. We've got Rise of Empire here, and we're also going to cover his new second one, which is Clash of Titans. It's a history of the American Mafia. But how are you doing?
Very good, thank you. And yourself?
I'm doing very well, mate. I'm really excited to get stuck into this because these were just incredible books.
Thank you.
I couldn't put them down as I was there, making podcast questions. So,
well, that's great. That's great to hear. Thank you so much. I'm really happy to hear that.
No, that's right. And I think the first question I want to ask you, and I know it's a bit of a cliche question, but what inspired you to write this series of books?
It was a chance encounter with Lord George Weidenfeld, who's from your country. I was in Sicily for an event that was hosted by a German media conglomerate, and they happened to, since everyone spoke German and English as a second language, they put me next to the most fluent English speaker, and he had introduced himself as George. He was a humble man. We hit it off. We talked about history the entire evening, and every era in history we went through. It was great. I mean, we're just bouncing around, and eventually we got to the 20th century, and he said, I fled Austria when the Wehrmacht rolled in. And I said, you got to be kidding me. And he tells me his story, and I find out, he asked me can he publish my next book? And I find out it's Lord George Weidenfeld, one of the most prolific publishers of the 20th century. He's done some of the greatest, your Elizabeth, Lady Elizabeth Longford, Lady Antonia Fraser. He personally had commissioned them and was very close with them. And so many others, de Gaulle's memoirs, Tito's memoirs, the Pope John Paul II's memoirs, Moshe Dayan, I think Lyndon B. Johnson's memoirs he may have done. Incredible. So I was like, what do you want me to write? Let's discuss this. And we met for lunch the next day, and he knew my background, and he said, I'd love for you to write. They left copies of I had an international bestseller called Mob Rules, and they left copies in everyone's room, the company that hosted the event. And he had read, I guess, a couple of chapters and said, I love the way you write. Why don't we do a history of the mafia? And we're sitting there in Sicily, and he literally made me an offer I couldn't refuse. We're overlooking the ruins of Agrigento. So, and I also too, I have to praise Lady Annabelle, his wife, who was a brilliant woman, and she contributed a lot to the conversation and helped convince me that it was the perfect subject to write about. Having said that, I had no idea what I was getting involved in. I read a lot of history. I love history. I love biographies. I love sweeping histories, multi-volume histories. But I never wrote a history, and it's a big deal. It's a lot different to think you could write one because you've read so many, to literally getting down, and sitting at your desk for 18 hours a day sometimes on end, and the sourcing and trying to figure out what goes in, what doesn't, what contributes to the storyline, what doesn't, what's real and what's not. I had a lot of, because I lived that life, I still had a mobster's mentality. I was on the streets for so many years, and I was in prison, the worst prisons in America, for so many years. So I kind of know what's real and what's not if I'm reading it. So I would spot inconsistencies if there were any, and I would say, this never happened. There's no way Albert Anastasia or Lucky Luciano would have ever said or done this. And then I would trace back to try to find where the original source of the material came from. And I would sometimes find it was maybe a journalist in the 1930s who speculated about something, and it was picked up by an author, and then the next author cited the last author as his source, and then the next author cited the first two as his source, and before you know it, they're all citing the original source, the last source, and then you don't really realize until you go hunting for that original source that it might not have ever happened. And I would try to explain that in my book time and again when I encountered those incidents, like, okay, I know that this would never have happened, but what might have happened more likely is this scenario. And I would bring the reader along with me. I did my best to have the reader think like a mobster as well, so that he or she can understand the way I'm thinking. So I don't just tell you it's this is a load of crap, and I'm going to tell you why. And I explain to you why it probably never happened and what likely did, and I want them to understand. But I keep the story moving while doing this. I don't want to ever be like bog anyone down in like lessons. But you read the book. I'm sure you saw that.
I mean, I absolutely loved going through on that decision process, because by the time you'd taken us through that thought process, you were there thinking, well, yeah, that's a completely implausible. There's no
Yeah,
way that ever happens.
yeah,
So it was a
yeah.
really nice
Right.
journey to go through, and I think it was quite interesting reading your take on it. How much did you think that your personal experiences aided you in not only like getting into that mindset, but also researching what had gone on?
Probably. Read a lot of so when I was in prison, after I picked up my first book and started reading, I never read a book before in my life till I went to prison. Uh, and it was, I'd cover to cover. I mean, I was literate. I knew how to read. I went to school when I was a kid. But I cheated my way through school. People did my homework for me. It was always a scam. I was running a chop shop, an automobile chop shop, while I was in high school. And I started hijacking cars when I was in my teens. So I mean, never read a book cover to cover, read my first one in prison, fell in love with reading. And I would only read like history, biography, law, philosophy. I wanted to learn. I desperately wanted to learn. And all the things I had missed out on, I was learning so fast and furiously that the curse of prison turned out to be a blessing. I was like, oh, wow, look at all the leisure time I have to think about nothing. You don't have to think about rent. You don't have to think about a mortgage. You don't have to think about car payments. You don't have to think about the electric bill, the water bill. All you do is just sit back in your cell and read. So it's like, okay, this was really, really a blessing now that I found what I love. So a lot of times, though, other people in prison would read true crime. You'd when you'd hear like Italian mob guys reading mob books, you'd hear a lot of bullshit. No way. This never happened. Give me a break. And these guys would be like, and you knew that they knew they were reading something wrong, but I wasn't reading those books then. So, with my own experiences, the same as theirs, when it came time for me to read them, it aided me immeasurably, where I was able to spot stuff immediately as they were. I was able to spot, give me a break. This never happened. Even The Sopranos, when I was the last couple of years in jail, the guys would come by my cell and they're like, Lou, The Sopranos is on. You got to watch it. They really do us good. Like they imitate us perfectly. And I'm like, I ain't watching that crap. What are you guys doing? That's what got us here. Why don't you pick up a good book? And, like in the end, I watched The Sopranos when I came home and it was great. It was done so well. When I lightened up a little after all the years of reading and research. But yeah, Lorraine Bracco, actually, who was Dr. Melfi in The Sopranos, actually bought the rights to my first book, and she wanted to make a movie about it. And that's when I was like, oh, I should have watched those darn Sopranos. But I did catch up on them, and they were great. They were great. Um, but yeah, so yeah, I mean, it helped me to answer your question. It helped a lot. I mean, if you're writing a book about number 10 Downing Street, it'll help if you spent many years or decades there. I don't even care if you're the butler. I don't care who you are. I don't care if you're the dog walker. If you're there for years and you hear everything that's going on, you know that place better than most people do.
And I think that really, really shines through in all your writing, because you get to go along with you, but also, you understand what's going on and the complex dynamics within there. And I think one of the complex dynamics I wanted to kind of touch on is you touch on the communities of Jewish people and Italians working together in the mafia. How does that kind of scenario, that relationship kind of build up?
So I learned that through my research. So I always knew when I was in the mob, I had a couple of tough Jews in my crew. And every crew had usually they were really smart Jews. that would like do like John Gotti was closely connected with a smart Jew who was instrumental in the garment industry for the Gambino crime family. Every family, always still had Jewish guys in the ranks. And like I said, I had two of the toughest Jews on the street, were part of my own crew. I mean, these guys were tough. So I always knew that the Jews got along with the Italians because even in my own day, that existed, that relationship. But I never knew to the extent until I started doing my research. And I found that a lot of people would write about either the Jewish mafia or the Italian mafia. And I wanted to bring that together and show how close they were and how they worked together. And they were really, really, it was almost like space time. They couldn't exist without each other. So, which was incredible to me to learn and then to write about it, to have the opportunity to write about that. The chief relationship that a lot of people know about was Lucky Luciano was dear friends with Meyer Lansky. And Lansky was sort of known as like the Einstein of the mob. But when Luciano took over the Borgata that he was in, the old guard that were very, very like clannish Sicilians who not only didn't want other ethnicities in the mob, but they didn't even want other people from other parts of Sicily in their clan, in their Borgata. So, for example, if you were in the Italian American Mafia and you were originally from Palermo and you met a guy from Agrigento or Castellamare del Golfo, you didn't want those guys in your clan. They were from a different part of Sicily. I don't want, and the Sicilians, by the way, are very, very like they're worldly people in the sense that everybody has been in Sicily. Well, throughout the ages, conquerors have been there, and they learned to get along with everyone. Palermo was like one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the world at one point. You had Arabs, Jews, blacks, Spaniards, you name it, they had it there. So not to take that away from them, but I mean specifically mafia clans. They were very clannish. And when Luciano took over the clan, his Borgata in America, he sort of paved the way for a relationship with the Jews through Meyer Lansky. And I got into that deeply. Lepke Buchalter was another one. Benjamin Siegel, known as Bugsy Siegel, was another one. But there were a lot of other ones too that came and went. And the Jews, when they first came to America, they were discriminated against to such a big degree, as were the Italians. Italians were looked down upon, and they lived in the same ghettos and tenements, the Jews and the Italians, and they became very close. Even when I grew up, I had so many Jewish friends. I can't tell you how many Yiddish words that I spoke regularly and never knew really that it was Yiddish. And one day, somebody gives me like a book on Yiddish, and I'm like, I'm fluent in Yiddish, and I never even knew it because I was just around all these Jews all my life. I just thought they were slang words, never knowing the origins of them. So that said, I wanted to like really, really show how close that relationship was, how the Jews in so many ways spearheaded the biggest rackets for the Italians, and how they just really, really formed this incredible relationship. And the Jews now in America, for the most part, are, they stress education, Jewish families. So, they've gone on to become, once the discrimination receded and societal opportunities opened up for them and institutions and society became less discriminatory against them, they were able to pave their way into so many different industries and excel because of their stress on education. So they become dentists and doctors. And a lot of Jews that I'm very friendly with today really, really weren't aware of the extent of the tough Jews that came before them and had no opportunities and joined the mob. And so I really, really show too, by Clash of Titans, by the second volume, by then the Jews no longer see the need to try to achieve upward mobility through the underworld, by becoming very wealthy in the underworld and sending their kids to college and stuff, because their opportunities are starting to become available to them, and they flee the mob like crazy. There's a mass exodus of Jews from the mob by like the 1960s, so that by time my time came, there was just a few. But I think I did a good job portraying how close they were in volume 1.
it was really interesting, reading about those relationships, which particularly Luciano's and Lansky's. How pivotal were they in kind of steering and modernizing the mob away from those kind of traditional Sicilian values that were there?
Yeah, well, incredible. So here's the irony. At one point or another, when Luciano, who was more of like, he came to this country, to the United States, when he was very young, 6 or 7 years old. So he kind of like was more Americanized than a lot of the older people, the elders in the Borgata. And so he was more modern, and he wanted to jettison all the old traditions and the oaths and stuff. And he didn't see any reason for it. And here's the irony: Lansky was the one who advised him. Lansky was like his sort of, Meyer Lansky was like his unofficial consigliere. So Lansky, being Jewish, could not become a made member of the mob. However, he had the same stature as Luciano, because when Luciano became boss, everyone in the family knew that Lansky spoke with Luciano's tongue. He was as powerful as Luciano. If he spoke, it's as if it's coming from Luciano. So he became an extremely powerful figure. So Lansky was the one who advised Luciano, don't get rid of all these traditional oaths and these traditional rules and regulations. And that's what makes you guys the premier underworld gang in America. There's a million ethnicities here. Everybody's got their own gangs. But why does the mafia, which is of Sicilian origin, stand out so much? This is Lansky's advice to Luciano. And he says, that's because you guys came here with the code, and you guys have to hold on to that code. And Luciano basically scratches his head and says, you're right. And he sticks with it. And although Luciano didn't necessarily live up to all of the things he preached, he did preach them, and he made sure that that was part of being in his Borgata. So, I mean, that came from Lansky. I mean, what are the odds that Lansky's the one who tells him, don't get too modernized too quickly. This is what makes you guys special. And so that just shows you one element of that relationship, where Lansky comes along and saves the day and preserves the Sicilian code of honor from Sicily and the rules, which is really, really an interesting, I made sure to mention that in the book too, because it blew me away.
And
But the other thing too is I realized Arnold Rothstein, as you saw, Arnold Rothstein was an old underworld gangster who basically mentored all of the biggest gangsters we know of today. And this didn't come from like a Jewish author who's trying to make the Jews sound like more than they are. It didn't come from Rothstein himself. This came from the actual Italian mobsters, time and time again, who said, I learned this from Rothstein. I was mentored by Rothstein. I sat at the feet of Rothstein. Rothstein taught me how to do this. Rothstein always told me that. Frank Costello, Albert Anastasia, Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, all of these guys praised Rothstein. So that was another thing I wanted to point out, that they also had like this mentor. He was like the Aristotle of like the Lyceum, the school of Athens. When all these new wave of philosophers are coming along, he's the real one who's teaching them everything. Well, I mean, you could go back to Socrates, Plato before Aristotle, but you understand what I mean.
And I think it was really, really interesting seeing those dynamics, but also how Lanksy is the one kind of saving those traditions and trying to push those people to follow them as well, particularly at those big conferences. But then, there was something you pointed out there of Lanksy and Luciano being immeasurably powerful. Just how powerful was the mafia, the mob, across this period from 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s?
I call it their golden age, and the reason being, it was the height of their power. And how it happened, it was a series of events that sort of like happened to create what the mafia became when they were at their height. And the first event was, so if you follow all of when I would go to all of the archived newspaper articles beginning in the late 1800s of when the first Italian immigrant mafiosos came to America, you would see that they were despised, they were looked down on, they were considered animals, they were considered barbarians, and they were known for mostly just murder. They would shake people down, they would bully people, they would muscle people. And on the bright side, they stuck together. They felt like they were in a new world where they were discriminated against. The Italian Americans were the second, very few people know this, and it's not taught in academia, which is despicable, but the Italian Americans were the second largest group in America lynched, next to African Americans. And very few people know that. So African Americans, I'm glad we learn about that because we should. They went through hell in this country, and they were one of the first peoples to come here. And I think that's good that they teach that in school. However, they just really just like completely go, there's a complete void where I was never taught in school that Italian Americans were even lynched. And the biggest mass lynching in the United States was of Italian Americans. And a lot of people, I would write after I wrote the book, a lot of people would say to me, I never knew that. And they're Italians. And they're like, I'm like, well, you went to school, right? Oh, I have a master's degree. No one ever taught you in the 50 years you were in school, like from when you were a kid to now? No, never ever taught. My own literary agent said I never heard of that before. I was shocked. So I went out of my way to purchase a photo of Italians lynched so that nobody could even question. I mean, all my sources are in the back. You could find this. It's out there. But I wanted people to immediately see the picture to show people that that Italians were lynched in the South, which was like the second biggest group in America. So Italians had a hard time. So there is an element of the original mafiosos where they wanted to stick together and they felt like, look, we need to do this to survive. So that's like the kind of like the excuse / there's a little bit of credibility to it. You could understand where they were coming from. However, a lot of hardworking, honest Italian immigrants did it the hard way and just ducked the slings and arrows as best they could and just kept pushing forward. But the rest of them, to go back to the original question, is a lot of them were discriminated against. And aside from that, though, they came here and they muscled people, the mob did, and they killed people. And that's really all they were known for if you go through the old archival newspaper clippings. And then suddenly they're like thought of as these barbarians, but suddenly prohibition comes around. And when they voted to prohibit the distribution or consumption of alcohol in America, all of a sudden, a lot of people in the country, the majority of Americans, felt like the government was treating them like children. Irish, German, Italians, everyone loves to drink, whether it's beer, wine, liquor, everyone loves to drink. And they all felt like the government was depriving them alcohol. And here comes the mob, the Jews and the Italians together. And they said, basically, we're gonna supply the American public. There's a demand and we're going to supply it. And that's when they went from being thought of as murderous barbarians to maybe they're not so bad. The whole romantic image of the mob kind of popped up. And they said, look, maybe the mobsters aren't so bad. They're giving us something the government's depriving us. We don't feel it should be illegal. And they're giving us the best alcohol money could buy in certain times. They had the best scotch from the Scottish Highlands at times. And they're also building speakeasies, places we could go where there's a secret knock on the door or a secret password, and we could go there and hang out and let our just not think about like the things we got going on at home and just let ourselves loose. And women, for the first time, were like women who had been chained to domestic roles like throughout the millenniums, were suddenly like cursing and swearing like men, smoking a cigarette, smoking a cigar with a drink. So even women were like, well, maybe the mobsters aren't so bad after all. They're kind of sexy and romantic. They dress well. They got pinstripe suits with these fedoras that go for like a few $100 back then. So this was an interesting thing. Yep. So that's sort of like the big change when they went from like the barbarians who were killing everybody to like the saviors of a republic. They're like, okay, these people aren't so bad. We want alcohol. Our lousy senators and congressmen voted against us having alcohol. And now we're getting it from those guys, those mob guys. They're not so bad. And that's when the mob started to forge alliances with politicians and police, because a lot of the politicians and police, even though they voted to prohibit alcohol, didn't believe in it. I mean, they were kind of forced to do the vote at times because there was a strong lobby, a dry lobby. And a lot of the policemen liked to drink themselves. You know, you had a strong Irish American police force in New York. Go tell a bunch of Irish American cops they're not allowed to drink. Good luck. Good luck. Go walk into a bar and just tell them none of you guys are going to drink tonight. If they don't shoot you, you're definitely going to get a boot in the ass right out the door. So, you know, and I can't tell you how many Irish American cops I know that will not have that. So these guys are like ready to partner with the mob back then. So the mob's now forging alliances with police and politicians who just don't feel that giving us alcohol is such a bad thing. So once those alliances are formed and prohibition is repealed, that's when basically the mob continues to keep those relationships with mobs, with politicians, rather, with police commissioners, with policemen, and there were no police women back then, but they continued to have those relationships for the next thing, which was gambling. And when they started opening up casinos, people were again like, hey, you know what? I want to gamble. The government tells me I'm not allowed to. Why can't I gamble? I like to gamble. It's my business if I want to gamble or not. And that attitude proved to be right because now the government just basically regulates the gambling. In every petrol station in America, you see, like, I don't know how many people are online to buy scratch-off tickets. I guess as long as they're taxing you and making money from it, it's okay. As long as they're taxing the casinos in Atlantic City and Las Vegas, it's okay. Well, the people weren't, saw that before and were asking, why can't we gamble? And the mob supplied them with illegal casinos at that time too, and eventually legitimate casinos. So they became like more and more of something that the people didn't see as a gang, but more so as like this romantic, mob thing that you eventually saw in the Godfather movies. That's sort of like, how it all started. And it continues today a little bit, a bit of that persona, like that romantic persona. But it's less true today.
And I find it really interesting how they went from kind of being this, threat to the government in doing and facilitating things they didn't want you to do, drinking, gambling. But then that rise in the relationship, the political relationship between the mob and politicians, how does that kind of affect American politics? Because several times you mentioned Democratic National Conventions, several politicians with links to members of the mob. How do they begin to shape American politics?
Immensely. So just to start with New York, and then we'll branch over to Chicago, and we'll start with smaller elections and go to the larger ones. So Arnold Rothstein, who we mentioned, he was the first one to sort of create a connection with Tammany Hall, which was the Democratic machine that controlled New York. You could not become the mayor or governor of New York unless you had the backing of Tammany Hall. And we had these political machines throughout the country, and it wasn't specifically Democrat. The mob is nonpartisan. They will grease the wheels of any political machine as long as it gives them in return what they want. And at that time, New York was run by the Democrats, so the mob greased the Democratic machine. Once Rothstein died, Frank Costello, who was one of his proteges, took over that relationship and became the premier underworld liaison between the mob and the Tammany Hall politicians, which consisted of different ward leaders, the lower boroughs, and specifically Manhattan, but most of the lower boroughs were broken up into wards where people had to get elected to a ward. And then after you have so many ward leaders, then you could elect the president of the hall. And then once you have the president of the hall, you could have a lot of say in who becomes the mayor or the governor. So Costello realized that if he could control the ward leaders, and he got this basically inherited it from Rothstein, but he took it to another level, Costello. Costello was the premier corrupter of public officials. And to the extent where he was putting in not only the mayor, the governor, but also appointing judges. So just imagine the judges who are supposed to preside over criminal cases are being put in by the mob. I mean, that's like, and this isn't like hypothetical or a possibility. This guy by the name of Hogan was a prosecutor in the mob, and he put an eavesdropping device on Costello's home phone. And one of the first things he picked up was a Supreme Court justice calling up Frank Costello, who at the time was acting boss of the Borgata started by Lucky Luciano. And he said, "Hey, Frank, I wanted to thank you for the appointment. I greatly appreciate it." He said, "Sure, if I tell you it's done, it's done." And he goes, "Well, thank you so much. I'm happy to be on the bench or what have you. And hey, no problem. Call me if you ever need anything." And Hogan is like, "What the hell? The head of the mafia just put in the Supreme Court judge? What the hell's going on in this city?" So Hogan runs to Tammany Hall, and he goes and he starts investigating Tammany Hall, and he's questioning everyone at the hall, including a guy named Kennedy, who's the head of the hall. And they all say to the last man, "We have no idea what you're talking about." "Frank who? Costello? Can you spell that? We don't know who you're talking about." Well, it turns out that they were lying to Hogan, because every single one of them were put in by Costello, including the guy Kennedy, who on other telephone calls would be talking to Costello later on. So, they had New York in their pocket. Once they had New York in their pocket, you're talking about a major city that controls how the state will vote in a general election. So, for example, just a quick politics 101 in America, the lower New York, where most of the population is very small compared to upper New York, upstate New York, which is much bigger, which goes all the way up to Canada. That small congested population will sway the way the state votes, because even though territorially it's only 1/10 maybe of the state, for argument's sake, I'm not sure the exact figure, but if you look at a map, they'll cover 90% of the voting because it's so congested. I grew up in Queens myself. I mean, it's just like we were on top of each other over there. And it's a melting pot, which is great. I grew up with every person from every part of the planet you could think of. And I think that helped me in forming who I was as I grew older. I dated women and went to different houses where it was completely different culture than my own, and they were exposed to mine as well. And I think that helps us as New Yorkers, we're one of a kind. But having said that, it's a very congested place, and they control how the state votes. So that said, because New York is crucial to a presidential election, they then made the jump and said, well, why don't we get involved in the Democratic National Convention and see if we could pick the president? And that's when they started to get involved in national politics. They were unsuccessful because they helped put in Franklin Delano Roosevelt, but Roosevelt double-crossed them. And Roosevelt was a sharp guy. Anybody who's ever studied Roosevelt, and I'm a big fan of him, FDR. He helped us win the war. Obviously, the triumvirate with him and Churchill and Stalin. Stalin was a sort of like, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. If we all hate Hitler, we could get along with Stalin. But FDR also forged an incredible alliance with Churchill. And I believe that if we did not have FDR's leadership during that war, it might have gone differently. So great guy, but they helped put FDR in, and FDR's just sly as could be. And he double crosses them. And Lucky Luciano basically says, I think to Frank Costello, look, he's a shit-ass double crosser just like me. I get it. No hard feelings. Like they really had a pragmatic attitude. He didn't take it to heart, Luciano. He was like, we double-crossed us. I double-crossed plenty of people. What are you going to do? But anyway, so they take a shot, and they've got close a few times. Now, if we hop over to Chicago, when Clash of Titans, Borgata Clash of Titans begins, the second volume of the trilogy, we bounce over to the Chicago at one point because just to give you some background first, the Kennedys, which are our like royal family in America, they're equal to our royal family, the Kennedys. As close as we'll have to a royal family would be the Kennedys. And at some point or another, Bobby Kennedy and John Fitzgerald Kennedy wanted to make a name for themselves in politics. The first Kennedy hopeful was Joe Kennedy's the patriarch, first of all. Let's just touch on him first. Joe Kennedy, as the patriarch of the Kennedy clan, was a bootlegger himself. He was engaged with the mob during Prohibition, and after Prohibition, when he had a liquor distribution company he wanted to distribute his liquor, and the mob controlled the distribution network. So he had to always partner with mobsters. He also had a production company that he needed to have relations with mobsters because to make sure that he had good labor relations, because they could stop a movie in a minute. If they stop the trucks, if they stop the actors, if they stop the food to the site, if they stop you from getting a site, etc., you will not make a movie, period. They could shut down a movie in a minute, the mob. So Joe Kennedy had to deal with them on a number of levels. And that testimony didn't just come from, because a lot of people, Kennedy defenders to this day, will say, oh, that's just talk. I didn't cite in my book only mobsters, which plenty of them said Kennedy was partners with us. But I went one further, and I cited people who were from the Kennedy family, from the Kennedy clan, people the Kennedys appointed as judges later in life, and they said Joe Kennedy was with the mob. There's no two ways about it. So I wanted to make sure that it was a consensus, that just so nobody goes, oh, I read one day I read he wasn't involved with the mob. Yeah, okay, that guy is a big defender of the Kennedys who probably said that. And I know all the ones who have said that, and I know who they are, which is fine. But I like a biography that is even keeled. You could defend the Kennedys when it's due, but at least tell us what's real. You don't have to hide things. So a lot of times, like, there are authors also too of like a lot of the founding fathers where, they came down from Mount Olympus, where I like to know they're human. I still have a lot of great respect and admiration for them, but it's nice to know when you're reading a biography, they're human. So that said, getting back to the Kennedys, Joe Kennedy was pretty dirty, and he made his fortune on pumping and dumping stocks, insider trading, and a lot of nefarious things. So here he is now. He wants his first son. First, he wanted to be president, by the way. He botched that up. So FDR, who he backed when FDR ran for president a couple of times, 3 times, won. But he backed FDR, and FDR first made him head of the Securities Exchange, where Kennedy said to him, you sure you got the right guy? I'm like the last guy you want for that. And he's like, well, it takes a thief to catch a thief. We'll use you. Then he made him head of the Maritime Commission. And then eventually he made him ambassador to the Court of St. James, which is the biggest ambassadorship you could have is London. The Great Britain is the biggest, most prestigious ambassadorship you could have back then. I'm not sure about today. It may still be the same, but back then. So he's thrilled. He's got that. And then all of a sudden, and he wants to eventually go for president, Joe Kennedy Sr. does. And he has a conversation off the record with 2 journalists one day. And basically Hitler has began to invade Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and it seems like he's just going to have a free-for-all in Europe. He's got the whole blitzkrieg war machine going, and Kennedy's kind of disheartened. And Kennedy kind of says to 2 journalists, look, democracy's done. Britain's done, and we shouldn't get into the war either, or we'll be done. If you want to be president of the biggest democracy in the world, it's probably not what you should say. So he wasn't like a savvy politician. He spoke what he really believed. One journalist kept it confident. The other one ran and wrote an article. So that kind of like derailed Kennedy Sr.'s chance of ever becoming president. So the next person he wanted to be president was his son, Joe Jr., who died flying a bombing mission out of England, trying to, before the Americans got heavily involved in the war, and we had some pilots over there. Joe Kennedy Jr. was flying, he started them, but he was flying a bombing mission out of England, and he died. He blew up, I think, over the skies of Suffolk. I'm not exactly sure, but he died. I can't remember exactly pinpoint, but he died. And then Joe Kennedy Sr. puts all of his hopes into the next oldest son, which was John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And John's younger brother, Bobby, basically the 2 of them go to Washington, and John becomes a senator, first congressman, then senator, and Bobby becomes chief counsel for the McClellan Committee. And when he becomes chief counsel, it becomes known as the Rackets Committee. And Bobby starts going after mobsters and taking them down. He's recommending them. He's not the FBI, but he's recommending them for prosecution. He's recommending they be deported, and he's browbeating them in public. He's constantly humiliating them in public, and they hate him. They despise Bobby. John Kennedy, basically, he's a senator on the panel, but he kind of takes a back seat. He gets involved now and then, but he's not as like, he doesn't accost them to the degree Bobby does. Bobby really, really goes after them. Where John does it enough, they're making a national name for themselves, but eventually they move on. The committee ends. John declares he's going to run for the Democratic nomination for president, and Bobby says, "I'm quitting the rackets committee, and I'm going to be the campaign manager for my brother Jack." So he leaves. The two Kennedys go off to run for president. Jack is president, and Bobby is his campaign manager. And they ask the mob for help because they know that the mob controls a lot of the cities, as I explained, New York. But New York probably would have voted for them anyway. But they needed Chicago, and Chicago had the same sort of thing. Chicago is in Illinois, and Chicago, however Chicago would vote, basically Illinois would vote. That's how it's going to happen in the presidential election. So who controls Chicago? The Chicago mob. So Joe Kennedy reaches out to the relations he has with the mob, and he basically says, "Hey, look, my kids made a name for themselves off going after you guys, but they're going to move on to bigger things once they get into the White House." And then he asks his dear friend Frank Sinatra, who's not only dear friends with the Kennedy family, but also the mob, a lot of mob bosses. Sinatra basically became famous with the mob's help. They gave him a lot of gigs in nightclubs they controlled back in New Jersey when he started out. And they helped him in every which way. In Vegas, eventually, they made sure they helped him there. So Sinatra is asked also, convince your friends, the mob guys, to help Jack become president. We're going to move on. So why would the mob believe this? Are they stupid? Why would the mob believe the Kennedys would move on? Well, if you look at history, Thomas Dewey was a prosecutor in New York who went after the mob, locked up a lot of them, Italian and Jewish mobsters. And then once he made a name for himself, he ran for governor, became governor, forgot about the mob, and eventually ran for the Republican nomination for president, ran against FDR, ran against Truman, and lost. But he made his national name through chasing mobsters and then moved on. He forgot about them. Senator Estes Kefauver, he had the Kefauver Committee, which also went after the mob. And he went across the country. It was like a traveling circus. He went everywhere in every major city, subpoenaed mobsters, attacked them. And then once he was done, he wrote a book about it. And then he ran for the Democratic nomination for president and forgot about the mob. He never talked about them anymore. He was done with them. So the mob had every reason to believe the Kennedys would do the same. And they're being promised by Joe Kennedy Sr., who they know and have done business with, that my boys aren't going to go after you, I promise. And Joe Kennedy Sr., his word was considered law within the Kennedy family. He held all the money. He held all the cards, and they all respected and listened to him. So the mob buys into this, and Chicago backs Kennedy. They dumped a lot of money first into the West Virginia primary, where Kennedy eked it out against Hubert Humphrey. And then eventually they helped him in Illinois, where during the general election, where he beat Richard Nixon. Now, here's a crucial piece, though, of the puzzle that later comes to have a great bearing on this whole story later. The mob went for Kennedy, and they dumped a lot of money into West Virginia, into Chicago, and into the coffers of his campaign. However, there were a few mob bosses who said, "I don't believe them." They had too much hatred for us, and they went after us to such a degree. And one of them was even deported to the jungles of Guatemala, Carlos Marcello, that we don't believe that they're going to just look the other way and let us get a free ride when this is done. Not happening. So they held out Carlos Marcello of Louisiana, the Don of Louisiana, Santo Trafficante, the Don of Florida, and the Teamster president, Jimmy Hoffa, who Bobby also went after during the Rackets Committee, who controlled the Teamsters, which was one of the biggest unions in the country, which was extremely infiltrated by the mob. Now, Hoffa wasn't himself a gangster. He was a union leader, but he had no choice but to make compromises and work with the mob because they controlled so many locals, union locals throughout the country, which then decided who became the president of the Teamsters. So the mob, just for a quick pause, this gives you an idea of how deeply they were entrenched in American society. Senator McClellan once famously said, they control the economy because if they tell the Teamsters to stop the trucks, they could strangle the economy in America overnight. And Bobby felt like it was too threatening to have the mob in control of the US economy. And that's one of the reasons why he felt he needed to take them down. And it was a life mission for him to the death do us part. You want to hop in, Jackson? I'm sorry, I've been going for.
That's fine. That was absolutely fascinating. That was absolutely fascinating to hear. But you were mentioning, Bobby's hatred for the mob and that mutual feeling from quite a few of the mob that developed over JFK's presidency. How does that intertwine with Bobby's relationship with Hoover and both of their deaths?
I'm so glad you asked that. Hoover's a big part of the story. And so J. Edgar Hoover is the FBI director. By the time Bobby comes in, he's been there for years and years through plenty of presidents, decades. And he's been there since Bobby's first teeth grew in. And Bobby, after Jack Kennedy wins the White House, Bobby becomes the attorney general. He's appointed attorney general. And reason why is Joe Kennedy Sr. told Jack to appoint Bobby because he did not want any of the allegations that there were voter fraud going anywhere. And he knew if the attorney general was Bobby, it's the only person they could trust to make sure that it's all swept under the rug. So they do that. Now, in case there are Democrats out there, the mob greased the wheels of Republicans just as easily. So I'm not pointing the finger in one direction. Both parties were corrupted. They eventually corrupted Richard Nixon. They eventually corrupted, they had always corrupted Jack Kennedy's vice president, Lyndon Johnson. So it was Republicans and Democrats. Obviously, Johnson being a Democrat, but Nixon being a Republican. So basically, Hoover, for decades, never went after the mob. And it's hard to figure out why. He just ignored them. He completely ignored them. He pretended they didn't exist. Anytime something crept up where he was forced to acknowledge them, he went out of his way to prove that, to debunk, to go after whoever would push this and sort of like try to discredit them so that he wouldn't have to go after the mob. So you wonder, why? So I did a deep dive into that. And I did a lot of research and I went far. And a lot of the common theory is, well, Hoover was a homosexual, which was unacceptable back in the 1960s. Now, nobody cares in America if you're gay. I mean, we all have gay friends. Some of my best friends are gay, men and women. And nobody cares. I have gays in my family. But back then, it was like anathema. Gays were in the closet and they were terrified of coming out. They just they would lose their job, they would lose their livelihood, they would be ostracized, they could even be prosecuted. And Great Britain, from the days of Oscar Wilde, was the same thing. So Hoover, a lot of people had allegations that, well, the mob had things like Hoover was caught in compromising positions and they had it on camera. And that was why. And they had him cross-dressing. And I keep reading these things, They had him on camera cross-dressing, dressed as a woman. They had him with the assistant director, Clyde Tolson, who was supposedly very close with him, may have been his boyfriend. They vacationed together. His meteoric rise within the FBI says a lot to contribute to that rumor that they were together. Both lifelong bachelors, both spent all of their private time together. So he probably had a relationship with Clyde Tolson, but I couldn't find anything that substantiated the rumors that the mob had anything. And where did they get it? Couldn't find it. Did they ever expose it? Couldn't find it. It didn't come out. We know that. So where did it come from? Well, I was able to trace it back to a socialite who was at a party and kind of made an off-the-cuff remark saying, oh, the mob's got stuff on Hoover. They got him, cross-dressing. They got him gay, in positions with other men. And that's why he never goes after them. Well, she just hated Hoover and threw that out at a party. A journalist picks it up. Another journalist writes about it. A historian grabs it. Another biographer grabs it, and so on and so forth. And I literally traced the line. And I'm going, there's nothing to this. So why the hell did Hoover leave them alone? That's my next question. So now that I've at least could say I haven't found any evidence to support that theory, Why then? What's the best theory? Is there a better one? Or maybe it's something I'm missing. Maybe that was true, but I just can't find where it really came from beyond that. Well, I found that people who wrote books about Hoover, who were in the FBI, and despised him by the time they wrote books about him, literally like disparaged him on every page and had no reason to hold back, would time and again say the reason was that Hoover knew that the mob was a tough foe and he did not want to tangle with them. One of the range of reasons that fall into that category would be, one is they have high-powered attorneys and they pay off judges and juries. So you're going to do a whole case, your FBI is going to prosecute them for like 6 months, a year, and then lose the case. Because some government attorney, some of whom are good, some of whom aren't, loses to a high-priced attorney who's worth $1 million, retainer, and then they buy 2 jurors and they buy the judge. Where are we going with this? Hoover did not want his FBI to show up really bad. The next thing was they were famously corrupting everyone. All the different local police forces across the country were on the take. Hoover didn't want his agents. Frank Costello, the agents were making $5,500 a year back then. Frank Costello carried that around in each of his pockets. He could literally meet an agent and say, here's $5,500, your entire salary for the year. I just want you to look the other way when I open that casino over there. So Hoover didn't want his agents being corrupted. Hoover didn't want them losing in court. And the next thing was, which was a crucial piece of the puzzle, Hoover knew that a forensic accounting of the mob's money would lead to Washington, D.C. If they're corrupting all these senators and congressmen, and Hoover had illegal eavesdropping devices across the country, and he's listening to them say, oh, that mayor bought and paid for, he's ours. They'd literally tell a mayor, move this police commissioner out and get us another one. We hate this guy. And the guy would the next day be in the worst part of town, and the new commissioner's in. So Hoover's listening to this going, their power goes all the way up to Washington, D.C., where I go for my budget every year. I have to go beg them to give me a bigger budget every year. They're the people who are in control of me. I'm the head of the FBI, but I have to listen to the American representatives who are elected by the people, and they're all in the pocket of the mob. What am I supposed to do? Have my agents surround the Capitol Rotunda and tell everyone to come out with their hands up? Where am I going with this? So even Bobby, as AG, tells Hoover, you're going to go after the mob, old man. And Bobby really treated him like an old, archaic figure. I don't mean old man from me saying it. That was Bobby's opinion of him. I have respect for my elders, believe me. I don't believe Bobby did. Bobby considered him like an old relic who needed to listen to Bobby now. There's a new sheriff in town. I may be half your age, but I'm the attorney general. You go through me and you listen to me. Hoover never was treated like that before. Hoover always walked up Pennsylvania Avenue and strolled into the Oval Office whenever he wanted to talk to the president. Suddenly, Bobby tells him, you have to make an appointment. You talk to the president through me. And now Hoover would make FBI press releases, and he would send them out on his own, what he wanted the American public to know. And Bobby would take the press releases and either discard them or tell him, I'm editing this. And Hoover's like, what the hell is going on here? Now, Hoover's trying to teach Bobby through example, I don't want to go after the mob. And hello, Bobby, would you like me to do a forensic accounting of the mob and how their money went to West Virginia and Illinois? And maybe how the money went to your father and how your father made his fortune? Maybe you won't want to hear about that stuff, Bobby. And Bobby didn't care. So when Bobby was on the trail of a mobster time and again, his minions in the Justice Department would approach him and say, hey, look, we were looking into that crooked Teamster local, and we found out that your father is the landlord for all their buildings. And there's some hanky-panky going on. And Bobby would become dispirited for the whole day. He couldn't even eat. He couldn't talk. He would tell them to drop the investigation. He didn't want to go anywhere near that. But instead of leaving the mob alone, he'd just pick up in a new direction with another mobster. So Bobby really just couldn't get it through his head that the mafia had infiltrated the United States government to that degree. And even if he understood it, he didn't care as long as it didn't come near the Kennedys. So, the hell with everybody else. I don't care. We're going to go after everybody. Lyndon Johnson, the vice president, Jack Kennedy's vice president, was funded, and he came out of Texas, Johnson, all of his congressional and senatorial campaigns in Texas were funded by Carlos Marcello, the Don of Louisiana, who considered Texas his satellite, part of his satellite to his empire. So Marcello, for a long time, was underwriting all of Johnson's campaigns, and Johnson, in return, would kill anti-rackets legislation and anti-gambling legislation in committee. It would never even reach the floor, so that Marcello could continue operating his gambling empire or his rackets, other rackets, and then take a piece and give it to Johnson for his campaigns. So Hoover is like, Bobby, you want to look into Johnson? That's your brother's vice president. You really want to go that far? Like he's telling him in so many words without telling him. And you could see it time and again. And I make the argument in the book. I mean, any of the readers of my book could see they're going back and forth. They've locked horns and they're not giving up. Neither one of them. Hoover's being dragged kicking and screaming into these investigations, and Bobby's relentlessly trying to drag him in, and he's not getting the memo. So that's the problem with Hoover. Hoover knows the mob was too powerful to take down. And by the way, to Hoover's credit, if I could say something nice about him, because a lot of people attack him for the most part, but to his credit, I believe that he was more concerned with who he felt were threats to the American way of life and American institutions. For example, Hoover wrote a number of books about communism and how communists were a threat to the United States. So it's the time of Lenin and Stalin, and communists, Trotsky and Stalin have the blowout. Trotsky wants to make the whole world communism. Stalin says we'll just leave it as the Soviet Empire, the USSR. And they're going back and forth. And Hoover felt like the few communists we had in America were a serious threat to capitalism, to democracy, and to our way of life. So that was who he targeted. And he never felt that the mob was a threat to our way of life, because what did the mafia do in Hoover's eyes? Well, when the American public was denied alcohol by a stupid error in government, who supplied them? The mob. They may have avoided a revolution. They definitely helped avoid them marching on Washington because they acted as a pressure valve. If you wanted to get drunk, you could just go to a speakeasy. Well, the mob's giving you what you need. He may have saved the American Republic until it was repealed and Congress realized that that was a dumb thing to do. So that's one thing. Then in Borgata, Volume 1, Rise of Empire, I go thoroughly into how the mob helped the U.S. naval intelligence during World War II. We have all of these ships when Britain stood alone. We have all of these ships leaving the port of New York and up and down the eastern seaboard going to supply the Brits. I mean, Churchill was by himself. The Brits were by the great speech, right? We shall fight them on the beaches. We shall fight them in the apartments, and we shall never surrender. We're sending the Brits we're the arsenal for democracies, and we're sending the Brits trying to help them survive. And if there's sabotage along the eastern seaboard, we can't keep the Brits in the fight. And later on, we even supplied the Soviet Union. So we were sort of like the arsenal democracies. We had to keep supplying Europe, the Allies. And there were U-boats kind of spotted several times and taken into captivity, people who were disembarked off the coast of Long Island. And this was a serious threat. U-boats in our waters, if they start taking out ocean liners or shipping cargo ships, or if they start burning down the ports, we have a problem here. If there's saboteurs, German saboteurs, and the mafia controlled all of the ports, all of the waterfront. So naval intelligence went to Myalansky and said to Myalansky, first they went to this guy named Joe Saxlanzer, who controlled the waterfront. Joe Saxlanzer says, look, I could help you. I'm fine with that. But my boss is Lucky Luciano, and he's in jail. But the only man who speaks with Luciano's tongue is Myalansky. Go talk to Lansky, and Lansky will get the okay from Luciano. So the naval intelligence goes to Lansky and says, look, we need your help. We need to secure the eastern seaboard. Will Luciano help us? We know he's Italian. And does he care about Mussolini, or is he with us? And Lansky goes, he's a patriotic American. So is his family. They don't like Mussolini. They don't like fascism. If I tell you right now, you could bank on it. Luciano will help you. I just need to visit him in prison, get the final okay. Lansky goes up to visit Luciano in prison. Luciano says no problem. And they lock down, no sabotage, no U-boats, no nothing for the duration of the war. And the Navy attributed that to the help of the mob. So going back to Hoover never really saw the mob as a threat to any of the American institutions or the American way of life or the American democratic capitalist system. And on top of that, plenty of mobsters joined up and fought. I mean, my own grandfather took numbers in a bar. He was a bookmaker. He's got 8 Bronze Stars from the Asiatic Pacific. He fought heroically. And then he came home, he's seen it all, hung out in a bar, drove heavy machinery during the day in a mob-infested union. He drove heavy bulldozers, backhoes, excavators. He built highways in New York. And at night, he sat at a bar, ordered a martini, a Manhattan, and he took numbers. I mean, he fought heroically. So did a lot of other mobsters. Matty the Horse Iannello was a tail gunner. I could give you, I don't know how many. Albert Anastasia joined the army and was teaching people how to work the ports because he controlled the ports. He knew how to do it. So these were all patriotic Americans, the mob was. They believed in the American way of life. They capitalized on it. They knew how to work it. Why would they want it to disappear? They don't need fascism where a bunch of fascists stamped them out overnight. They couldn't survive with Stalin. Stalin would have them in a gulag literally by the morning, all of them rounded up and in a gulag, and they'd be sitting there with Alexander Solzhenitsyn going, this sucks. Wow, this really sucks, Al. Yeah, I know. I think I'm going to write a book about it. Like this is where they'd be. So instead of that, they just keep prospering in America. They love the system, and Hoover knew that. So that's a crucial, I think, piece of, I think, dissected what was in Hoover's mind better than anybody else I've read. And I don't mean to sound immodest, but I think I got to it, the bottom of it.
No, and it definitely makes sense for Hoover to think that way, given his age, his experience as well. But I've got a final fun question for you, as we do for all guests that we have on the podcast. As you've mentioned already, your experience is directly related to the way you wrote the book and the way that you approached your research. But is there a character across the 2 books who you would least like to have met?
Bobby Kennedy. I hated him. I loved John Kennedy. As people, forget about what they did, forget about their decisions in office, forget about their politics, forget about all that. As people, hanging out with them, I could have hung out with John Kennedy every day of the week. John Kennedy was so easygoing. You could chill in Palm Beach at the Palm Beach Kennedy Estate. You could chill at Hyannisport, game of touch football, a couple of beers. He was so cool. Now people may not like him after the Me Too movement. He was a philanderer. He would have been Me Too'd all day long. He fooled around with every woman you could think of, any woman he could get his hands on, every woman in his sphere. That aside, before that was anathema to the public today, just as a cool guy, you could hang out with John Kennedy all day. He never held grudges. He was easygoing. He liked people. Bobby hated everyone. He had a chip on his shoulder. He had grudges with everybody. He held grudges. Joe Kennedy said famously, Bobby hates like me. He's the only one of my sons who hates like me. Never holds a grudge forever. And he also said at one point, I think he told either Oleg Cassini, the fashion designer, or Cassini's brother, he said something to the effect that if Bobby lived in Germany during Hitler, he would have made a great Nazi or a great Gestapo, and he would have been really serious about it. He would have loved it. That's like his own father telling you about him. Like, who wants to hang out with a Nazi? Give me a break. Talk about just the fact how serious they were. You don't want to even have a drink with them, let alone everything else we know about them and how hated and despised they are now. But you can't even have a drink with a Nazi because they'd be like, too serious of people. And that was Bobby. I hated Bobby, and it was bipartisan. Republicans and Democrats alike couldn't stand him. I quoted both. His own family pointed out all his flaws. He was just a tough guy to like and to get along with. Major chip on his shoulder, and he was relentless. His crusade against the mafia, I believe. And we won't give this part up. I think I'm not sure how much time you have left, but I believe he got his brother killed or contributed to it. Bobby did, with his relentless antagonism and crusade against the mafia, and against other people in high government. I think they couldn't stand Bobby, and at some point they made the decision that if we go after Bobby and kill him, Jack will send out the National Guard. However, if we kill Jack, Bobby's disempowered overnight. That was the mob's part of the conspiracy. I believe there were also a cabal that involved government people, ex-CIA agents or active rogue CIA agents and Cuban exiles. I outlined the entirety of the cabal in Volume 2 of Borgata, Clash of Titans. But I do believe that Bobby contributed to the mob's participation in that plot.
And I think that's a really nice answer, saying that you wouldn't want met Bobby, but also, I think it's a really nice point there to say, if people want to go and learn more about that and learn about that conspiracy that led to JFK's death and Bobby's death, where can they go and grab a copy of Borgata?
I would say the easiest spot is Amazon UK, if you're in the UK. And it should be in all stores. I just don't know. I got a couple of emails from fan mails of people who told me I had a hard time finding it, and then I found it, and I'm so happy I did. There was one woman who recently wrote me a letter and said she persisted until she was able to order. She kept ordering it. But I think the easiest thing is Amazon UK. It's at your door the next day. They're so fast. That's probably your best bet. If you go to your local bookstore, you find it, great. If not, go straight to Amazon. My website is louisferrante.com. You could also click the UK editions. There's UK editions for volumes 1 and 2, and there are US editions. So make sure you click the UK if you're in the UK, the US if you're in the US. But that's probably the best bet. Just grab it on Amazon.
Fantastic. And you even preempted me by telling everyone where your website is as well. So,
great.
But thank you very much for coming on. I really enjoyed it.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast. Hello and welcome to the History of Jackson podcast, the podcast where we bring up-to-date historical research to you in an accessible and digestible way.